Hello everyone! Welcome back once again to the offices of the Game Detectives. This video marks the second official Zelda month here at the Game Detectives.
Now today we're going to look at one of the more divisive games in the Legend of Zelda franchise, Twilight Princess. Now, the final feelings in the game differ slightly between me and David, but we do agree that it is one of the weaker titles in the Zelda series.
Before we start, we should make clear that we're going to be discussing the Wii version of the game, since that's the definitive version of the original product. We won't discuss the Wii U remake or the GameCube versions. To give it credit, from the very beginning, Twilight Princess was given a difficult task. Ocarina of Time was still being heralded as the masterpiece that it is, and the departure in art style from Wind Waker met with mixed reception from fans. At this point, Nintendo could have either doubled down on experimenting with new concepts in art, or retreat back to what they knew worked. In the end, Nintendo made the safe choice with Twilight Princess, taking quote-unquote heavy inspiration from Ocarina of Time. This results in an identity crisis that produces most of the game's major issues.
On paper, it sounds like a good deal. More Ocarina of Time has to be a good thing, right? But there's an inherent difficulty, perhaps impossibility, in following up such a heralded title. And it's the main reason why you won't see games like Half-Life 3 anytime soon, and why you shouldn't be upset about that. With both Majora's Mask and Wind Waker, Nintendo tried something different with the Legend of Zelda franchise in order to get out of Ocarina of Time's shadow.
You can feel Ocarina of Time's fingerprints on everything, from the dungeons to the pacing of the game. However, where Ocarina of Time excels in the gameplay between dungeons, Twilight Princess has troubles with pacing right from the start. It's unfortunate because what we're presented with here is a collection of some of the greatest 3D Zelda dungeons and bosses, and even some great set pieces at points in the game as well, which are usually the main attractions to any Zelda game. The problem comes when you have to do almost anything other than these dungeons and bosses.
There is an incredible amount of filler in this game between every major event, and none of it is fun. It is all a miserable slog. You don't get to the first dungeon until 2 hours into the game, and you go through the Faron Woods 3 times before you're even able to enter the dungeon. Similarly, almost every section between dungeons is boring and long. Whether it's a buggy and frustrating fight with King Bulbin on horseback, or finding a way to get the water back into Lake Hylia, the sections between each of the dungeons feels unnecessarily padded and, most importantly, boring.
The biggest reason for the padding actually stems from the game's main concept, turning into Wolf Link. In the first half of the game, before you can even explore certain sections of the map as Link, you must find 15 Tears of Light as Wolf Link. While the game developers may have intended for these sections to introduce you to new areas of the game, they could have just as easily let you explore it first as a human, as they did with every other game up till this point. While the Tears of Light add a unique spin on exploration in Twilight Princess, that spin isn't at all successful, and actually serves to slow down the pacing of the game entirely. The environments here are simply not complex or interesting enough to be navigated multiple times without it getting tiring.
Another way the game brutalizes its pacing is the way you get portals. Battling the Twilight Beast is always frustrating and not at all entertaining. The multiple times they are fought in the game never increase in difficulty, only tedium by adding additional numbers. These moments don't challenge the player in any way of logic or skill, and after 5 or so hours, let alone over 20, it really begins to wear you down.
Of course, if Wolf Link was at least somewhat enjoyable to control, the Tears of Light and Twilight Beast sections would be at least serviceable, right? But Wolf Link controls so poorly at times that these sections become even more unbearable. It's extremely awkward to transition from the bipedal Link to the quadruped Wolf Link, and the shoddy controls don't help at all. While some of the fault could be laid on the basic motion controls of the original Wii system, the awkward jumps Wolf Link uses to attack makes these controls feel even looser. I think Wolf Link fails as a new Zelda mechanic, but it often feels like something you're forced to do, and there's nothing the wolf can do better than Link can. You can really only run around, track, and attack. You can move faster on Epona, and you have more effective combat options with the sword, so ultimately, what's the point of using Wolf Link when you can from a game perspective?
Unfortunately, many of the controls for Human Link have the same awkward and loose feeling that Wolf Link does. Since Twilight Princess was released before the development of the Wii Motion Plus, Link's sword attacks do not actually follow the motion of the Wii Remote. Rather, waving the Wii Remote acts in the same way as a button press, with Link simply swinging a sword every time you wave the remote. This makes attacking some enemies extremely difficult, especially the fight with King Bulbin on the Bridge of Eldin. The inconsistencies of Link's attacks makes the game feel much less immersive as intended, and you constantly struggle to execute certain moves using the Wii Remote.
However, some of the items actually work better with motion controls. Moving the bow and hookshot with motion controls and reticles on the screen actually makes these items much easier to utilize than in previous versions of the game, as you simply can move your remote to aim rather than adjusting the camera angle using analog sticks, making the use of these items seamless and action-oriented.
While the motion controls are iffy at best, the special sword moves in the game actually make combat more enjoyable and less repetitive than other games. Unlocking these moves is quite a chore, because you do have to find a musical statue and howl as Wolf Link to find the golden wolf on the map. However, almost all of the moves from the ending blow to the helm splitter more than make up for these optional quests. Each hidden skill helps you defeat certain enemies in the game and makes combat much easier. Not to mention that each individual move is actually enjoyable to execute.
Unfortunately, where the updated moves excel, the updated and grittier story does not enjoy the same experience. The story is serviceable, albeit a bit dull, even for a Zelda game. Many elements feel forced or contrived just by virtue of having Zelda in the title. Zelda herself has no personality or character to speak of, and she has absolutely no bearing on the plot whatsoever. But it's Zelda, so I suppose she has to be there. Fighting a possessed Zelda as part of the final boss is a unique idea, but the player and story is so uninvested in this Zelda in Twilight Princess that there's no real emotional reaction to fighting her whatsoever.
The same could be said about Ganondorf, who really only exists to be a last-minute fake-out villain and offer fan service for those who remember the climactic battle from Ocarina of Time. The main villain, or at least presented as such, is Zant, the Twilight King of Darkness. He does nothing of interest in the entire game until the latter end, where he seems to just go insane. At least then you have some interesting animations and vocals, but right before Twilight Princess looks like it might add something memorable to the mix, it switches Zant out for Ganondorf. The story yet again is quashed by the need to repeat the beats from Ocarina of Time.
The only character of any note, and what feels like Twilight Princess's only real addition to the series, is Midna. Midna actually subverts everything in-game, giving us a unique-looking design, an interesting backstory, clever commentary, and a satisfying conclusion. Midna is probably the best of Link's partners utilized through the 3D Zelda games, and it's really your only real motivation to continue. It's actually kind of surprising how well this character is done, but it's no surprise that Midna is what most people take away from the game after playing Twilight Princess. Midna represents the best of the game, whether she's cracking some witty one-liner or actually making an emotional departure. Midna never ceases to keep the player on their toes.
Not all of the game feels as fresh as Midna though. Many, if not all of the dungeons, feel like improved versions of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask ones. At points it very much feels like you're revisiting the Great Deku Tree, Snowhead, Death Mountain, the Temple of Light, the Water Temple, and many other familiar locales, only better. This sounds great, and the dungeons are fun to play through and feature creative puzzles, but everything does end up feeling like a retread. I suppose it comes down to personal preference. Would you prefer slightly better versions of dungeons you've already played through, or dungeons that feel like something new was at least attempted? I certainly prefer the latter.
I actually thoroughly enjoyed almost every single one of the temples in the game, besides the Palace of Twilight. The Forest Temple offers a nice introduction to how dungeons will be set up in the game. The Goron Mines utilize the iron boots in a fully unexpected way, letting you walk on walls full of magnetic rocks. The Lakebed Temple, while using yet another water gimmick, actually has areas that feel like what a lake bed would be, with lots of aquatic flora and fauna. The Arbiter's Grounds actually manages to make a rather eerie and freaky sand temple, and being able to zip around the spinner in that room is absolutely fantastic. The Snow Peak Ruins has Yetta and Yetto, and expertly combines both the mansion and the snow motif. While some people might find opening large chests just to get cheese frustrating, I actually find it kind of charming, and the tongue-in-cheek jokes that are used in this area could be used more frequently in the game. And finally, Hyrule Castle actually feels like a real lived-in castle, with so much atmosphere that you could cut through it with a knife. Overall, I think Twilight Princess has the strongest set of dungeons of any Zelda game, as almost all of them are fantastic. Some of them do feel like retreads, sure, but so do most of the dungeons in every Zelda title.
While the dungeons may have some great puzzles, the art style of the dungeons and the game as a whole just doesn't hold up. This is one of the biggest problems prevalent through every inch of the game. Twilight Princess's art design is a direct response to the criticism that came from Wind Waker's art shift. Many criticize the game for looking too childish or cartoony, something I'd strongly disagree with. As a response to this, Nintendo grossly overcompensates in an effort to make the game appear darker and more adult. This results in an unappealing filter over the entire game that literally makes it appear darker, versus trying to achieve this feeling with tone or other elements of the design.
You could argue that the game is attempting to be more realistic with the approach it takes, but I think the only people who would argue that would be people who were 12 when the game came out and haven't played it since. A big part of the blame here goes to the fans and critics who demanded a more, quote-unquote, adult experience after the, quote-unquote, juvenile Wind Waker, assumingly after being teased by their Vice City, GTA, and Medal of Honor playing older brother.
Everything in the game, from the models to the textures, is ugly and not pleasant to look at, and at no point do I feel that it achieves in creating a more intimidating environment, especially when compared to the darker moments of Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and even Wind Waker. It's hard to describe what you're ultimately looking at without using the word edgy. Even when the game does try to utilize sillier looking characters, it doesn't succeed, as they're anchored within the reality the game presents and just end up looking disturbing in all the wrong ways. Termina was full of characters and creatures designed specifically to unsettle you, and Twilight Princess just doesn't get the same extent in its more disturbing elements. It doesn't help that the characters that are supposed to look normal or even beautiful still look like unholy abominations.
There are some character designs that I do like. Midna and Link have pleasant designs, and some of the NPCs with simpler aesthetics, like Iza or Henna, actually look presentable. The character design wasn't so much a problem for me, but Hyrule Field itself just seems empty and gray. There isn't a whole lot to do in it, there's a lot of it, and I simply do not feel compelled to explore it in the way I did the sea in Wind Waker or the fields in Ocarina of Time. Touting a full open environment was a big point for this game, but I think again it retreads Ocarina of Time too much by almost replicating it. Hyrule Field is far bigger and emptier than it has any right to be, and most of the time there isn't much to explore or interact with. Unless you like useless winding paths, catching bugs in odd places, and riding around in large empty plains, Hyrule Field doesn't feel immersive or engaging whatsoever.
I found the music in the game to be about on par with Skyward Sword's. There aren't really any new memorable pieces to me besides Midna's theme. The songs are more atmospheric than melodic, especially when compared to Ocarina of Time or Wind Waker, and I prefer the latter. Overall, the soundtrack is serviceable, but I don't know anyone that's going to call it their favorite, and I know that I won't.
I think the music lacks the same kind of finesse that other 3D titles have. Most of the dungeon themes are basic and atmospheric, and don't add much to the game. I did like the Snow Peak Ruins, Temple of Time, and City in the Sky themes, but that's more so because they fit in with their environments well, rather than actually being enjoyable to listen to.
All these points summarize why I think Twilight Princess fails as a Zelda game. The Zelda series had difficulty in its modern years balancing innovation with familiarity, and Twilight Princess shows these aspects at their worst. To me, it also proves how important it is for a video game company to be confident in its own creativity and not spend too much of their time responding to criticism from fans. Which only shows how important it is to acknowledge and question these flaws, as time has proven that audience reception does very much affect the development of Zelda games. The negative reception of Skyward Sword from the general public proves this even further. Audiences don't always know what's best for them. It's like Henry Ford used to say, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. Thankfully, Nintendo chooses to ignore these notions in the future and essentially reinvent the wheel with Breath of the Wild. Regardless of your feelings on the game's success, trust me, I have many that we'll get to in 2 weeks' time, it must be commended that Nintendo put themselves out there and truly tried something fresh and new. So those were our thoughts on The Legend of Zelda: The Twilight Princess. Did you play the game when you were 12 and disagree with us? Do you like the game?
Make your case down in the comments.